All right, fantastic. So, hello everyone. For those of you who just joined us, we're talking about a slightly esoteric topic of crossing the Rubicon and reaching Rome. I think most of my social psychological colleagues or psychological colleagues would call it more something like goal setting or goal striving. We talk about these terms a little bit in the beginning. I hope by now you watched both of these short videos to give you a little bit of an idea why we call it crossing the Rubicon. And this really crucial distinction between whether you're on the left side or on the right side. I will come back to that in a second just to remind you of what you might have watched, or if you missed it, just so that we are sure that we're kind of on the same page. It's really important to revisit that because it touches on a lot of really important intervention approaches. I think my wife, she teaches, among other things, at the London School of Economics, a course for executives, so people who are managers and come back to kind of get better at managing people. And the key thing they often in their feedback said, like, the crossing the Rubicon, that metaphor was by far the most helpful thing that you taught me. And you don't have to spend 100,000 on your masters. You can just come here in week 6 and learn it from me. So I think that's the added bonus. But before we come to crossing the Rubicon, this distinction, and kind of see how this applies to different areas of trying to help people to set the right goals and achieve their goals, I want to talk a little bit about where we're at. We're in the second half of our the module. We have only 5 weeks left. I'm not very good. I think yesterday in the office hour I realized that sometimes I say week 9 and you might think of a different week than I think. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So today we talk about goal setting and goal striving. And in a minute I will kind of talk a little bit about how this connects to what we have done so far, right? What is the connection with the content of the previous weeks? We talked then about 2 specific things that are quite interesting. This is racism. We will take this also as one form of looking at, if I want to change the attitude of somebody, what can I do? How can we change implicit and explicit attitudes of people? Racism is a very like unpleasant, I think that's not the right word, it is too euphemistic, but as one really crucial attitude as an example, but I think these lessons can apply to other topics. And then we will talk about reducing the spread of fake news. We will talk a little bit about the impact of how social media might work or might not work to make our life better or worse, and what we can do about this. We have in the ninth week, we talk about nudges and behavior insights. This is, I think, if you kind of, yesterday I talked to like the director of the behavior insights team at former Public Health England, right? So this is basically people who have the knowledge that we are teaching you here, often go on, if you're interested in to work in these behavior insight teams. I want to give you a bit of an understanding what that means, what type of approaches they have. And this is also a different way of looking how social psychology can influence policy and how in a policy realm our knowledge is used. And then in a 9.1, so in the seminar that we're having, this would be your chance to get some formative feedback on your intervention. So what I want to do on that Thursday is just block the whole Thursday. You can book a spot on like a time slot for 15 minutes. You have like 7.5 minutes to present your intervention to me, and then we have 7.5 minutes to talk about what you can do better, or what is good, what you should leave alone, or what you should try to change, or how you can increase that. I think sometimes some students come to me or via email or in the office hours and just like, oh, this is what I've written so far. Can you give me feedback on that? I can't, okay? I think I have to kind of give everyone the same chances, and this is your chance to kind of get feedback on your presentation. I would strongly urge you to take advantage of that. I'm happy if you don't, right? That means I have another 15 minutes to finally answer some emails or anything like that. But I think it's a really good thing to get feedback on your presentation, and then to kind of, it's formative. It means it has no impact on your mark, even if you just come there and have just 2 slides, and then only the problem, or you want to verify something, perfectly fine, right? So that would be your chance to get kind of feedback beyond the office hours. If we can, I don't know, like in the last year, we had formative feedback about, out of the 80 students last year, about 60 took, or 58 roughly took advantage of that. So if we can fit it in one day, then we will do this on week 9. If some can't find a spot in week 9 because the day has limited hours, then we would go and I would make the same offer in week 10. But ideally, we do it all on a Thursday in the 9th week. And then I would kind of take a little bit I think what I saw from your interventions, what I see as key problems, what I think I anticipate, or what I have just seen in week 9, and say, like, okay, if you want to kind of level up your intervention, what are additional things to think about if you want to really go above and beyond, or what are common problems that I see? So whatever knowledge comes up, I think I have a long list of things to kind of, instead of like a review of everything we did, I want to review it by saying like, oh, make sure you have this thought about in your intervention, make sure you have that, and so forth. So I kind of called it leveling it up, and I think I have a lot of ideas, but I will also kind of tailor it a little bit to whatever comes up in that session in what I call week 9, which is like, if you count the reading week as a real week, would be week 10, but it would be the second to last week. And then on a so we talk about how to level up. I think it would be fun to do something maybe a little bit more social in the last seminar. Maybe I can come up with something that's a little bit social, but it's also a little bit related to our topic, but we'll see. I think traditionally this is the seminar where the fewest students come because coursework is due, etc. But I think it would be nice to kind of get to know each other a little bit better. Maybe I'll think about something, and if you have a good idea, let me know. This is basically what we will do in the upcoming 5 weeks. So halfway through, and now, today we want to talk about something which is like goal setting and goal striving. There are many different names. Sometimes it's like goal setting and goal commitment, or and self-regulation, self-control, willpower, all of these different terms. And I'll try to kind of highlight a little bit how these each fit to this idea of the Rubicon and how we can make use of that. Motivation and volition is one. I think I talked in the videos about this. So there's on the left side of the Rubicon, I will talk about this in a second, again, what the Rubicon is, and what I talked about in the videos so far for preparation for this lecture. But on the left side, this is on of the Rubicon, this is what we traditionally call motivation and social psychology. And on the right side, this is volition, which is another word for self-regulation or self-control. Okay, so this is basically kind of like what I introduced in the videos as preparation for the today's lecture, but it's just kind of like, so this is the Rubicon, right? This is the river. If you have not watched anything, it's all about crossing the river. It doesn't really matter. But the idea here is that basically on the left side of the Rubicon, you are thinking about whether or not you should pursue a certain goal. And this is the classic realm of expectancy value theories. The most prominent example of that is the theory of planned action. We had that in social psychology in the last year. If you have health psychology, you're probably bombarded with it, because I think 80% of all the interventions are focused on the theory of planned behavior or health belief something model. They're all expectancy value theories. And the idea is basically that people have a certain attitude towards the goal, They perceive certain norms around them, whether it's good or not good to pursue this goal. And they have expectations. They have expectations about if I reach that goal, what will happen. They have expectations about their own ability to control their behavior. And they have expectations of how strongly their behavior is related to success. Okay, so this is all on the left side of the Rubicon. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but these are basically the kind of variables that matter. And so this is when we are in a motivational state. The left side of the Rubicon is the motivational state. Here it really matters to think about attitudes, norms, and expectations, okay? And the idea of the Rubicon model, which is really, really crucial, is that if you form an intention, you enter a different state of mind. You're interested in, you perceive yourself differently, you have a different mood, you have slightly different beliefs, okay? So there's something that changes dramatically when you cross the Rubicon, that in psychological terms is you form the goal, you form the intention to pursue a goal, okay? We'll come back to this again and again, but this is the crucial definition, okay? And so if you want to have an intervention that kind of thinks about something that's related to goals, if you want to change the goals that people have or help them to commit to a certain goal, then you have to first figure out on which side of the Rubicon are there, because strategies that work on the left side do not work on the right side, and vice versa. Right? It's like if you are not sure whether you want to pursue a goal, then you are very much interested in different information, different strategies than if you know you want to pursue a goal, but then you kind of, you don't want to know. You actually think, oh, I want to run a marathon, or I want to have write a great intervention manual for the Ps3033. You don't have to be convinced that it's a good idea, or that others think it's a good idea, or that you can do it. You already have that past you. You're interested in different types of information and strategy. So this is the key difference, okay? So I think it's really important to understand that, and we'll come back over and over again, because sometimes this is something that I think students sometimes forget, where we kind of do not think about in which state the person I'm addressing is in, and hence we kind of fail to have effective interventions or even effective conversations with our friends when they ask us for advice. So how does this kind of like this goal setting and goal striving, right? How does that fit into what we have done so far? I think last week in a seminar, I said that this, or like 2 weeks ago, last session, I said that these goal striving strategies that we will talk today about are really nicely kind of like a chance to supplement a lot of these wise interventions, right? As you remember, I think Carol Dweck talks a lot about it, like what is the context in which wise interventions can really flourish. One thing is, yes, I now change my perception of maybe my intelligence or what's the meaning of stress is, etc. I have some kind of changed meaning, experience some kind of changed meaning, but still I might not have the right strategies, or my environment might not offer me the right strategies, for instance, to study successful or to kind of harness stress effectively, etc. Okay, so I think this is something where often wise interventions basically a change in meaning of who we are or of our environment or what happens to us. It's really good to kind of then think about, okay, if they have now this changed meaning, well, how can I help them? I think if you remember when I asked you guys, do you think that intelligence is something that is fixed or malleable, right? I think about 100%, it might be maybe one person disagreed, but all of you said, oh yes, I think that intelligence is something that can change, and that effort that we can grow, that it's like a muscle, right? You're all on board of that, right, with that. So now you might feel like, okay, so this can't be the reason why maybe one of you guys did not put enough effort into the preparation of the manual. Right? So now I have to think about, oh, maybe she or he is lacking certain strategies to set these kind of positive beliefs into actions. And this is what we're talking about today, okay? I think when we talked about self-esteem as like an example of an intervention that doesn't work, right? Enhancing self-esteem, increasing self-esteem is something that doesn't work. And then we talked about self-affirmation as a good way to kind of trying to help people to ward off threats to their self. I think there's another way to think about it is like once you have to, like you're ready to perform, you overcome your anxiety related to a certain topic or performing in front of others, then how can I now help you to be even better? And that would be something we would do today as well, kind of teaching you strategies to kind of handle that. The fifth bit, I think when Doug was talking, he was talking very much about the importance to kind of furnish self narratives with also with plans, with specific plans. And you will see there's a lot of research on the beneficial effects of forming specific plans on our performances. And so this was something where he tried to integrate the research we have, will present today, with kind of his idea of the importance of self-narrative. So you can kind of think about if you're trying to help people to change the narrative they have about themselves and who they are and how they fit into the environment, then you can kind of give ideas about how to form really effective self-narratives that then might help them to further advance their performance. So there is a connection between all of that. I think, and sometimes the best way to kind of, if you realize that your intervention participants have already formed this goal and have all the beliefs and norms and attitudes in place, then you have to focus on the goal striving, on the right side, the willpower, the self-control side of your intervention. You do not have to convince them again, for instance, that intelligence is something that can grow and that effort pays off. I hope that makes sense. I will try to kind of reconnect what we have done to the previous years to the content today. So the first question is, how can we help people form commitments to their goals? How can we help them kind of cross the Rubicon, okay? So there's just like, oh, I really want to do something. I really want to become famous. I really want to, I don't know, start my own YouTube channel. I really want to have a really good mark in Ps3033. I really want to have like a first grade degree when I leave university and so forth. So people kind of ponder these things, but somehow, and often I think people fail to act on them. They might tell you that they really want to do X, but never really do anything about X. They really want to start a YouTube channel, but never start a YouTube channel. So how can we help people to kind of commit to these goals and get acting? Often when we kind of encounter this in social media, there's some ideas that are related to The Secret. I don't know if you have ever heard of The Secret. I think this is one of these topics where I tell people about it, and I'm trying to change their minds about The Secret. But some of you guys might be so invested in this idea that you can manifest your success that I might not be able to change your mind. But for those of you who are not familiar with The Secret, this is a famous book. I've not read the book. I've only have no intention to read the book. But the idea basically is that if you want to achieve your goals, if you want to kind of become a famous YouTuber, what you have to do is you have to manifest it. You have to imagine yourself doing it. You have to kind of not yourself doing it, imagine basically the good outcomes of it. You should kind of imagine, manifest, oh, when I start my YouTube channel, then I will have cars and houses, and people will come to me, and I will be famous, and I will be admired, and so forth. I don't know, whatever the reason is that you want to start your YouTube channel as this instance. You can also obviously talk and think about, like, why do you want to get a first degree? If I have a first degree, everyone will be so happy and proud of me. My parents will say, like, wow, well done. I will be proud. I will be so happy, and so forth. So the idea is that you basically manifest these things. So you should kind of have these daydreams about your success, and that will help you. And so I think in the videos before, the leading up to this lecture today, I talked a little bit about my ongoing dream. I really want to learn R. I have not yet learned R. Last year, I used the same example, and yes, unfortunately, I have not learned it yet. And you'll see why maybe when I walk you through the other strategies. But here the idea would be like, okay, if you want to learn R, you basically have to imagine having learned R. And I walk to the podium, upload my slides, show my latest computational model, my computational model programmed in R. I can see how impressed everyone is. They think I'm the coolest. They think I'm the coolest scientist ever. After the talk, people come to congratulate me, invite me to join their dinner at the end of the conference. I made it. Okay, so that would be kind of like a fantasy that I have that I'm trying to manifest. And the idea would be basically that kind of helps me to manifest the success and start working on it. Okay. So what does research tell us about it? Does that work? Is it a good idea to daydream about success? This is my former PhD supervisor, Gabrielle Oetting. She has a kind of best-selling book. If you want to also read a little bit about me and you want to read basically about the negative effects of positive thinking, then you can read her book. But she investigated this for I think now 3 decades, looking at does positive thinking, does daydreaming, does kind of imagining your success actually help you to achieve something? Okay. I think that was the earliest study she did, one I still kind of really like. And here they measured how often women do that. So these were all women who were trying to lose weight. So they wanted to lose weight, and then they would kind of measure how often and how positive their daydreams, their kind of fantasies were about being thin. Okay, so I think I remember one description where the woman kind of writes down that she imagines every day how it would be that if she's finally thin, she can come out of the pool and everyone will admire her and she will look great in her bathing suit and so forth. Okay, so she has these and she rates them. So she is then asked to kind of rate how positive these fantasies are and how often she has them, right? And what they find in these studies, do I have? No, I don't have. What they find in these studies, and Gabriella has done this for now 30 years, over and over and over again, it's the more often you have these fantasies, the more positive they are, the less likely you are to act on your goals. So it seems like that manifesting, imagining, attaining something has a negative outcome on our goal attainment, on achieving the goals we want to use. It's almost like, and this is the idea here, is that what it does is that it makes us feel in the moment kind of good, like we achieved it a little bit, but thereby undermines our motivation to actually do something about this. So here's some other research that's quite interesting. The more people have these positive fantasies, they're also the more predictive they're of their negative symptomatic, like the depression level. So obviously you can imagine if you do engage in an activity that prevents you from being successful on a regular basis, then this will also increase your levels of depression. This is work by my wife here, Positive Fantasies About Idealized Futures, ZAP Energy. They're actually measuring physiological indicators of motivation during the experience of fantasizing positively about achieving a goal, and they find that this decreases your physiological motivation, not only your psychological but also your physiological motivation. Just imagining something is really bad advice. Manifesting, we will come back to this. There are several lines of research who also find very similar ones. So imagining achieving an outcome is really bad advice. This is something that you shouldn't do, that will undermine the success that you or your friends will have, or if you do an intervention. So you shouldn't do that. So what can you do instead, right? So one thing that, okay, so I'm not sure. Okay, so Gabriella, what she did is she invented this kind of, not invented, she found that basically what people do, what she calls mental contrasting, that kind of utilize their fantasies in order to achieve their goal, is they contrast their fantasies with obstacles that stand in the way. Okay. So what they do is like, and I'll walk you through this. There's in the slides, if you download them, there's a link to this website. You can do it yourself on the website. I think there's also an app. There are many, I think with the publishing of the book, I think she also published the app and the website and so forth. So this is like a well-researched strategy for how you can basically help people to cross the Rubicon, to help them to commit to their goal. And basically it starts a little bit like a positive fantasies. So you're asked to imagine, for instance, oh, you want to lose weight. So what's the best outcome? Why do you want to lose weight? And then this is probably for everyone individual and idiosyncratic, right? You name one thing why you want to lose weight. And then you're asked to imagine, just as the woman that I described in the first study on this topic, imagine herself kind of leaving the pool and being admired because she lost so much weight. Then you should do that yourself. So what is the thing that would be the best? Now imagine that outcome. And thereafter, they ask him to identify an obstacle. Okay, so here the idea is that you need to contrast the thing that motivates you, that pulls you towards this, with something that prevents from you. So what is within you in this example, the focus on something that you can change that holds you back from fulfilling your wish, right? I think you can say like, oh, I can't resist, for instance, the sweets in my fridge, or whatever it is that kind of prevents you from losing weight, whatever is related to kind of your diet that prevents you from doing that. So you have to kind of imagine an obstacle. So you have something positive and then an obstacle. And what happens now is that, okay, so you're also asked again to imagine this obstacle. So what you can see in these studies is basically, okay, let me give you one more. What I want to say is what you see in the studies is that helps people to cross the Rubicon. So when they do that, basically when they first imagine achieving something and then contrast it with an obstacle, they commit, and here's the critical thing, in line with their expectations. And I'll explain what that means in a second. So in the Julius Caesar's example, you can think about, okay, if he's at the Rubicon, he's standing there and thinks like, oh, should I cross it or not? Should I attack Rome or not? Should I become the dictator, or should I try let go of that dream? He can first imagine why he does to want to become the new Caesar, the new dictator, and then he has to think about all the things that would be in his way to get there. And what happens is basically that this helps you to commit to a goal, from the why to the how. From the left side of the Rubicon, from the right side of the Rubicon, from motivation to volition, or whatever term you prefer using. One key thing is here, and this is some of my own research, is that the ISAT, it's in line with your expectations. Okay, so you can think like, well, sometimes there's a goal that we set ourselves, right? And it's just absolutely unrealistic that we achieve that. For instance, you say, oh, Andreas, what do you want to do? It's like, well, my goal is I want to get a Nobel Prize in physics, right? There's zero chance that I will ever get a Nobel Prize in physics. So if you kind of ask me, and this is, you can see this here on the x-axis, my expectations of success, right? So here you would basically see, okay, there's a very low expectations of success. If you do mental contrasting with very low expectations of success, what you see is that people, what we call, disengage from these goals, okay? So a solid line is the mental contrasting line here. These are people who were experimentally induced to do mental contrasting. And what you can see here is that each of them, they basically let go of their goal, okay? So I would basically give up trying to become like a Nobel Prize in physics, and would say, okay, that's not for me. But if I feel like I have a chance, and if my expectations of success are high, then people strongly commit to their goal. They really go for it. So what you can basically learn from this technique is this not leads you to commit to kind of fruitless endeavors or pointless endeavors, because you have so little chances of success. Now, what it triggers is that if you do this with a friend, if you do this with yourself, if you do this with your intervention participants, that they consider the expectations of success they have and then commit in line with them. We will address a little bit later when we talk about procrastination, what to do if, for instance, people have, rightfully so, for instance, really low expectations of success, how you can reframe it and then use this technique. But I just want to kind of stop talking about this specific technique, but this is basically one of the very few known, well-validated strategies to look at if people have some kind of wishes, daydreams, goals that they're only loosely committed to, and if you want them to get going, to make a decision, to cross the Rubicon, then mental contrasting is a fantastic exercise to do so. And I'm saying this not just because I did research on that. So basically what I should do, right, is like I should imagine first that that everybody likes me because I presented this fantastic computational model using this elusive programming language that I should that I want to learn. And then I think like, okay, what are the obstacles? I might not have enough time during the semester to work on this on top of teaching, admin work, marking, emails, etc. There's no time left to do this now. So I think by doing this exercise, it would help me to realize that this is maybe not a goal to pursue, a good goal to pursue right now, and I would let go of it. And that can have very positive effects of us too. I think I talked a little bit about this in social psychology, but if you can see people who are very stressed, anxious and depressed, they often have a lot of very ambitious, unrealistic goals, and letting go of them is a really is another really good thing that you can do. It's not just helping people to cross the Rubicon, but sometimes, depending on the problem you're looking at and depending on the situation, it's also really good to help people to let go of unrealistic goals. So, for instance, if you think like, I don't know, if you're a man, you think like, oh, I want to be a perfect father, I want to have a perfect teacher, and I want to have a six-pack or something stupid. Then I think like maybe realizing that the time I would have to put into building a six-pack would be too wasted. It's too unrealistic that I can achieve that, so I can let go of that. I don't daydream, I don't fantasize about that anymore, but can use that energy and mental space for something more fruitful. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So now I think there's like, what happens on the other side, right? Imagine that you would basically have a client, have a friend, and you walk them through them, right? They're basically now, you just did, for instance, a mental contrasting exercise, they're committed. It's like, okay, now I'm on the other side. Now I want to know, how can I achieve my goal, right? I'm interested in that. But it's not that just by basically crossing the Rubicon, just by going over there, it's not that just like, oh, all problems are gone. Oh, I committed to the goal. I really feel so motivated. I really want to become thin, have a six-pack, learn R, get a first in this module, etc. Whatever your goals are. So you basically formed the intention, that is the crossing of the Rubicon. You're now in a volitional phase or in a goal striving, not in a goal settings phase. But now there are all these problems that prevent you from kind of doing the behavior you need to do in order to get you to your metaphorical realm. So these are some of the problems that wait on the other side, right? So one of them, I come to this in a second. So one of the things you can see here is that people kind of think, okay, now I have the intention, right? And most health intervention used to stop there. There's like, oh, people have the intention, and the intention is the best predictor of the behavior. Not quite true. Past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, but intention is a very strong predictor. But as you can see here, as you know from your own life, it's not guaranteed just that if you want to and really commit to something that you can do that. Let me first kind of talk a little bit about what is called the intention behavior gap. This is most studied, best studies in health psychology, right? Where people would kind of say they want to use a condom, they want to screen for cancer, they want to exercise, they want to eat healthy. You kind of do an intervention, you convince them that's really good. Most people are already on board, and yet they fail to show this behavior. So this is a study by Pascal Sheeran, where they looked at basically this kind of intention behavior gap, okay? So here you can see on the left side, these are people who have no intention to perform this behavior, okay? So as you can see, I don't know what these people are doing, but they said like, I don't want to go cancer screening. Somehow they ended up cancer screening, or I don't want to exercise, right? And somehow they ended up exercising. Might be a little bit more realistic, but it's basically if people don't have the intention to perform a behavior, they will not perform this behavior. So it's really important as a necessary but not sufficient condition, but as a necessary condition to help people to form the intention. So once they have formed the intention, you can see basically roughly there's a 50-50 split. Half of the people is like, I really want to exercise more. I really want to go and get a cancer screening. Half of them do it, half of them don't. Right? And this is what basically the intention behavior gap is concerned with the half of that do not do it, right? Why do not do it? What are the problems that stop them? And how can we help them, right? And I think we all have been there, we all will be there, that we have a good intention, that we really want to do something, we're convinced we can do it, we feel this is something we should do, the people around us support us, and yet we fail to do it. So what can go wrong? So if you kind of look at a meta-analysis, this is also like, I forgot the reference here, but a meta-analysis by Webb and Shearer, and they looked like what is basically the correlation between intention and behavior. What you find is like it's like a medium to strong correlation, 20 to 35%. So it's about 0.5, the correlation between intention and behavior. This is really strong. It's a really important effect, but it also means there's a lot left to explain, right? And I think a lot of these quotes, I would just run through them, kind of, we know that this is true from, I think, in every language, in every culture, there's some kind of expression that relates to the failure of basically from saying to doing. So Cervantes says like, it's a long step from saying to doing. Actions speak louder than words. Talk is cheap, practice what you preach. It's easier said than done. Put your money where your mouth is. The road to hell, my favorite, is paved with good intentions. So all of them kind of attest to this idea that basically there's, that there's a problem between wanting to do something, saying that you want to do it, having the intention, and performing that behavior. So what are the problems? Like changing your mind, right? This is like often a problem that people experience where they think like, oh, actually, I didn't really want to get a really good grade in this, or maybe I shouldn't try this, and so forth. These problems are related to when people do not form a strong goal commitment. And so I will not talk about this. We will talk about getting started, which is, I think, in its most prevalent form is procrastination. People procrastinate and do not get it started with the actions. And we talk in the next session about that, what we can do in order to help people to get started. Another problem is staying on track. And we will talk thereafter about staying on track. So this is basically you overcome your procrastination. You started to study, but then somehow a distraction leads you astray and you end up spending 5 hours, like several hours on Netflix instead of studying. Somehow you fail to stay on track. There are two other problems that we will not talk about, but I uploaded videos on Moodle about overextension. When people have too many competing goals, what can we do about that? And also calling a halt. This is something where people invest too much in endeavors that are not warranted, that are not a good idea, right? Where somebody pursues something and the likelihood of them achieving that is super low, or it seems like it's a lost cause, but they can't stop pursuing that. And then there's another video that I uploaded on Moodle where you can look at that and how to help people in these situations, okay? But let's start with talk about getting started, okay? So this is basically, I crossed the Rubicon and now I need to kind of size a good opportunity to act. I have to remember to act. Sometimes we just forget that in these situations, oh no, I should have maybe asked questions. I should have done this. It's another common problem related to basically to procrastination or to failure to initiate your goal relevant behavior. you have to overcome your initial reluctance, right? There's something that's like, oh, I don't, starting is hard. So there's some reluctance to get started. What can we do? How can we help ourselves and others to be better at that? So we're kind of like in a planning and acting phase of the Hackhausen and Gorwitzer Rubicon model to kind of give you a little bit of theoretical guidance. So one thing that was kind of, we had it a little bit when we talked about mental contrasting. Another thing is like that often that is studied is kind of looking at mental simulations, how people think about the goal pursuit. How do they think about the road from where they are to where they want to go? And how does that impact their performance? One of the very key distinctions here is what's called outcome versus process simulation. So if you have an outcome simulation, then I want you to use like the instruction would basically be, I want you to visualize yourself meeting the production goals. I don't know why I used this weird example here. I think this is probably what they used in the text. And imagine how you would feel. In your mind, form a picture of your team actually meeting the production goals. So this is very similar to what we talked beforehand about imagining succeeding at something, right? This is basically the idea here would be maybe the problem is why people do not get started is that they don't imagine enough themselves why they are doing it. They should imagine themselves doing or achieving their goals, and this will basically propel them into action. The pull of their fantasies will propel them into action, right? By now you should already be a little bit suspicious about this idea, but this was the idea about outcome mental simulation. The other one is I want you to visualize yourself performing your jobs in a way that would lead you to meet your production goals. In your mind, form a picture of your team actually acting in ways that would lead you to meet your production goals. So here the idea is basically, if you think about studying, right? So either you can imagine basically, oh, this will feel so good once I submit finally on Moodle my intervention for Ps3033. Thereafter I can guilt-free watch Netflix. I will treat myself to this wonderful food. This will feel so amazing. Can't wait to tell the others that I already submitted mine, right? This is an outcome simulation. Versus you think like, okay, how do I get there? So I think on Monday morning, I have 2 hours from 9 to 11, and this is when I will sit down at the library and try to work on my intervention. And I will do this for the next upcoming 5 weeks, and this will ensure that by the end of the semester, I will have my intervention ready, right? You visualize the process. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry, as you can probably imagine here, when they kind of looked at, this is a total hours studied and the outcomes, when they did this with students, what you can see here, here's the outcome simulation, and here's the process group. So the people that were instructed to visualize the process of how to get there, and here are the ones that kind of visualize the outcome. You can see here that outcome decreased their performance compared to the control conditions. So people who frequently imagined doing very well, and this is kind of like is in line with the research I cited beforehand, right? They get worse, right? It makes you worse to imagine achieving the outcome. But those in a process condition, they not only got better grades, but they also had they had higher exam scores. They had basically they planned minus actual hours studied, right? They were kind of the hours they planned to study were matched with the hours they actually studied, right? Here you can see they planned a lot but didn't do much. And here's like the total hours of studies. You can see there's like a difference of 6 hours. So a massive difference in terms how much effort the process versus outcome group put in. So it's a real kind of like, if you want to help people to, after they cross the Rubicon, or if they already crossed the Rubicon, to achieve their goal, is to visualize the process, not the outcome. It's a really key. Outcome is like imagining achieving something is for motivation for really, really bad. Okay. It's not a good thing, has no real good effects. Okay. So try to avoid that. When you go, okay, So yes, okay. So you like what you can see is basically that performance, the process simulation, decreased anxiety, but maintained high aspiration. Right. This is often a problem that people like they get into studying, and then they lower and lower and lower and lower their aspiration. It's like 2-1 is fine too. Submitting on time is good. Maybe I get ECs, and then I etc. etc. Okay. So it's really good, important to maintain your high aspirations. But also process simulation seems to reduce your anxiety because it probably reduces the uncertainty related to the process of getting the desired outcome. This is very much in line with one of the most successful programs in social psychology in particular, but psychology in general. And this is called implementation intentions. This is Peter Gollwitzer, which you heard a lot about in the videos, but also in this lecture today. And he has this program where he looks at simple plans that help people to achieve their goal. Okay. And there's literally hundreds and hundreds of studies. One of the key tools that most people who use these behavioral insights to help people perform utilize. And this is basically on top of having a goal intention, I want to achieve goal X, you also kind of enhance them by using specific implementation intentions, okay? And implementation intentions are if, then plans, okay? I'll talk about this in a second. So it's like if situation arises, then I will initiate behavior, okay? This is really good if you cross the Rubicon. If you are thinking about how can I achieve my goal, then you can kind of identify critical situations and then form behaviors that help you to overcome that, okay? So if you go on the Whoop website that I linked in, it's like on the mental contrasting website, they combine mental contrasting with these if-then plans. So you can see on the same website how to make an if-then plan, but it's like, what can you to overcome your obstacles? So if you just imagine your obstacle, it's like, okay, this is my biggest obstacle. What can you overcome? Name one action you can take on or thought that you can think to overcome your obstacle. This is also a little bit in line of kind of like this idea of wise intervention, that you actually already kind of know what you should do or how you can overcome that. But it's just like give you a structured way of thinking about the problem that will lead you to the right thinking and thereby increase your chances that you achieve your desired outcome. Let me just kind of skip through that and talk about basically this idea of getting started. How can you use that to help people to overcome procrastination, okay? So you put them if queued and response, okay? So you identify a future goal relevant situation, okay? And then have a related goal directed response. So often if then plans, they're very much similar to process simulation, just a little bit more specific, because they ask you to specify the situation in a format of when, where, okay? So which is like, on Monday morning in the library, and what will you do there? If I am on Monday morning in the library, then I will immediately start writing my intervention, not manipulation, my intervention, okay? So here's like putting in a if Q then response, you can say, if the waiter offers me a dessert at dinner tonight, then I will say just an espresso, please. So if your biggest problem is that if you go out, you overeat on desserts, then this might be a really good way to do this. If you form implementation intentions, really important to not do the kind of if behavior then outcome track. A lot of students in their interventions, when they form it, is like, oh, if I study, then I will achieve the outcome. No, this is not what an implementation intention is. This is not what an if-then plan is. An if-then plan is a situation and a behavior, okay? There's also research, which is really interesting, that shows that you should not in this kind of furnish them with a why. As you remember, the why is part of the left side of the Rubicon, not the right side of the Rubicon. Reconsidering why you're doing something is not a good way of implementing the goal striving that you want to, okay? So you shouldn't at that stage talk with people about the why, leave that alone. So if the plan is something, if the waiter offers me dessert at dinner tonight, then I will say just an espresso, please, because I want to lose weight, this is less effective than the one without the why. Okay, so don't talk about whys when you're on the right side of the Rubicon, when you're in the process of goal striving. Okay, I will skip these specific mechanisms because we're kind of running a little bit out of time, but they're very well researched. There's literally hundreds of studies on this, kind of show that you increase the accessibility of the situation and then almost automatically respond in the way you had planned out to do so. Sometimes Peter Gollwitzer calls that an instant habit. Okay. Let me kind of like, there's another one, let me skip through that and just talk about, I think in the last 4 minutes, per usual, I achieved less than I wanted to in this lecture, but that's fine. There's another, this is kind of control level theory where you kind of think about, okay, if you want to help people to implement their behavior, you can basically kind of quiz them again and again on the how, not the why. Okay, and thereby you help people to achieve their goal. One final thing I just want to say, and I think I might then just stop here, is that, so procrastination, right, is one of the most kind of like the failure to get started. Basically, you sit down and it's like, oh, I don't want to, I'd rather clean my room, I really have to call my mother, etc., etc. So you do things, everything but starting. It's one of the key kind of obstacles to performance, right? Especially for students, academics, very high in procrastination. They somehow never get quite to it, which is weird because if we would do it, we would profit so much from that. And there are two things that I kind of wanted to highlight here, and it kind of helps us a little bit to also connect that to the previous content. So often procrastination is not so much a problem of time management. So sometimes I think, especially in tutorials, your tutor will come and tell you, oh, I see you started too late. Let me help you to manage your time better. Here's a calendar. But the problem is not the calendar, but there are two key problems here that often exist. One is one that students often have that procrastinate a lot, have somehow the suspicion that they are not able to perform in the way they wish they can. Okay, so their self-efficacy is not high enough. You can see here procrastination in college students, the role of self-efficacy and anxiety. The title is not great because what they find is basically that only self-efficacy predicts procrastination, not anxiety. It seems like that if you have high self-efficacy, you have also low anxiety, and that helps you to not procrastinate. You feel like you can't quite do it. Right? So it's basically you avoid the task because the task might tell you that you're at the moment not able to perform the way you envision it. So you kind of deal with a threat to yourself. So procrastination becomes a protective mechanism to protect your self-worth. Okay, and that's in some ways a good mechanism, not a mechanism you want to undermine. Okay, so how can we handle that? Like one of the things you can do is to break the goal into really, really small bits and then see if people can commit to one of these kind of steps. So think about, you want to write, you think, oh my God, I have to finish my manual for Ps3033 in 2 weeks. Okay, I'm so stressed, I haven't started. Oh my God, I have to find a problem. I have to do the causes, I have to find an intervention. And so the goal seems really threatening. But what if you break it down and say like, okay, here's a goal. Can you work tomorrow on your intervention for an hour and commit to writing 200 words? So one short paragraph. And that feels very much like, oh, I can do that, right? So now it's the self-efficacy that relates to the goal is the one whether you can do one of these chunks. Sometimes when I talk with my students, I think like, okay, like maybe you can't do an hour at the moment, perfectly fine. What about half an hour, right? Can you do that? What about 5 minutes? Can you do that? Sometimes you have to start with 5 minutes because this is the only kind of small enough amount that helps you to feel that you have enough self-efficacy to overcome the procrastination. So sometimes our problems are more related to our self-integrity, right? This is the idea also of the self-worth theory, kind of like the, and I linked to a really good TED talk in the slides here, where they talk about that basically what prevents us from not procrastinating is not time management, it's not maybe the perfect framework of planning, but is how threatening we perceive a task to be. Now connect that to the wise interventions who are trying to basically change the perception of the threatening character of the task, right? And so often this is more effective in helping people to stop procrastinating by helping them to deal with the threat to the self, right? One way to deal with the threat to the self would be, okay, before you start working on your intervention, why don't you do a little self-affirmation intervention, right? Write about some of the things that make you the person that you are. And thereby you have kind of a boost to yourself, to yourself. You don't feel so threatened if you engage in a task. Has nothing to do with time management, has nothing to do with making plans, has nothing to do with any other thing other than protecting yourself. And yourself wants you to not engage with this task because it anticipates that something bad is ahead, and there might be some information that you do not want to know about yourself, okay? So I think there's different ways of thinking about procrastination, things that we already talked about. It's just important to highlight that, right? Okay, I think we are now at 11:56. I'm afraid I have to stop here. Some of you have to leave. We will see each other tomorrow in the seminars, and we will talk tomorrow a little bit about interventions, start thinking about interventions, and also talk a little bit more about the Rubicon. So see you all tomorrow, and maybe later today, forensic psychology for those who are interested at 4 p.m., how to become a forensic psychologist. All right, take care.